Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Nice to see all of you again. After me being back and forth for a little while, I am, Lord willing, in town and healthy and, here for a little while. So Mark's been very kind to sub a lot here recently, which is greatly appreciated. Class is always good with Mark teaching, so I appreciate that. Okay, so we are in 2 Samuel 7. Y'all got started a little bit on that last week, but I could tell, Mark was itching to discuss some of those messianic connections there, and he's 100% right in making that observation. You cannot understand 2 Samuel 7 in its fullness if you leave it confined to just the events that are happening right there. There's more going on than the story of David, more going on than the next chapter in the narrative of what David is doing in his life as king. There are promises here that are being connected to things that will happen for many generations to come, that will happen for messianic prophecies that affect us even today. So this is chapter 7, where David has done a lot already to solidify his rule. In the last chapter, we talked about how he had gotten Jerusalem prepared as a new capital city, a new home base. The Ark of the Covenant is now there in Jerusalem as well, so we have a political and religious center of activity now, all in one place. This is really the first time that they've had that, and different than the way that Saul managed it. David is being pretty savvy here, I think, in that he is trying to do something that's going to appeal to all 12 of the tribes. That they've carved out this new city that was not previously a part of any of them, and it's more central than what he had before. Of course, the events of getting the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem were complicated, and there's a misstep there by David in that he is probably thinking a little bit too practically and a little bit too focused on like his own goals and purposes for this, and there's a failure of the people around him as well, that the high priest is not there to stop him. The people who ought to know better, even with Uzzah and Ahio, have not, spoken up and said, this is improper. And so Uzzah loses his life over his choice to reach up and touch the ark. And David was very afraid. But by the end of all of it, the ark did get into Jerusalem. It was done properly. It was done in a way that honored God. And then you talked as well last week about Michael's discomfort with the way that David was conducting himself, and I agree with the take I think that you guys had in class that this isn't really about David being naked or not wearing enough clothes, but more about not conducting himself in a way that Michael thought a king should act. And she basically says that Saul would have done this better, but we see that there's an end to Saul's lineage that's been going on all throughout these two books, that Saul's line is going to die, and that includes even the line through Michal, that she does not bear David any children. So chapter 7 is David's next step. In verse 1 it says, "Now when the king lived in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies, the king said to Nathan the prophet, 'See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent.' And Nathan said to the king, 'Go, do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you.'" Why did David want to build a house for God?
That's a good question.
It is a good question. Yes, Eric. Yeah, I agree with it. Yeah, Ida, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's already built, but why do we want to continue to build the house?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So building up the house of God, like even though the house of God is the church now, and we don't need to create it, we certainly do build it up. We certainly do work to honor God within it. And Eric's point here is David is trying to honor God out of respect and reverence for him. Dave?
Well, I put the ear into, so I wanted to say that it's very possible that I kind of felt, why am I living in such a nice house when I've got God's, intent?
Yeah.
So I should be living better than God is.
Yeah.
That kind of weighed on him a little bit.
I think so, yeah. That David is seeing the contrast between what he is living in versus what God, or the Ark of the Covenant is dwelling in, and that bothers David. So he wants to honor God.
It's kind of an interesting contrast to those who came back from captivity.
Yes.
They were building their own house
Yes.
and leaving God's house in ruins, and God chastised them for doing that, having their own house, living in comfort,
Yeah.
and not building his house. So this is really interesting that I think God had a reason why he didn't want David to build his house.
Yeah, so, much later on, when the exiles have come back from captivity, that, they were spending too much time working on their own houses and on paneled houses, on not just trying to survive, but really trying to live in luxury. And they left the temple in ruins, they left the walls of Jerusalem in ruins, and several prophets were sent to them saying, look, you got to put first things first. You can't leave the temple of God like this. Okay.
Well, Nathan didn't ask God. He just gave his own opinion. So,
Yeah.
speaks to him. But he didn't say he asked God about that.
Yeah, I find that interesting as well. This whole event is odd because the way Nathan responds to David is with great certainty that yes, this is a good idea. Go do all that is in your heart. The Lord is with you. But you're right. God, he didn't actually consult God here. I think based off of what God's response is after, that God had not told Nathan this. And so Nathan is kind of making an assumption. So between Nathan's assumption that this is a good idea and David's assumption that this is a good idea, we have a lot of assuming going on. And yet at the same time, I think we don't want to be too pessimistic about this. I think we're picking up on the right thing here, that David means well and Nathan means well. That it's hard for them to imagine that God would not want this. It's a good thing to do. It's going to serve to honor God and to make the worship of God more visible to the whole community, to the whole nation. There were all sorts of reasons why it would be good for a house of God to be built. And so they have prepared to move forward with this. Okay?
And we should never just assume that something is a good idea.
Yeah.
I want to be doing God's word. So it's a good lesson for us.
Yes, absolutely. It's not good for us to assume, even when we think we have really good reasons for it, that we should use God's revelation to show us what he actually wants. And many times when we see how people want to worship God or what we want to do in the church, there's a lot of, I think this would be good, and I feel that God approves of this, and I'm just trying to honor him. A lot of very well-meaning things that aren't actually what God has said. Mark?
Yeah, I think if there was any accusation about this, it would be that David simply wanted to look like the other kingdoms.
Yes.
He really wasn't thinking about God, but the writer goes out of his way to tell the reason why he wanted to do it. That was to bring glory to God. I think I mentioned this last week. When you look at Chronicles, he really wanted that direction, that God deserves all this glory. And I
Yeah. So that is like more of the pessimistic take on why David is doing this. And let's talk about that briefly. So another way you could read this is, David isn't really trying to honor God, but he is trying to be like the nations around them. He's falling into the idea that the pagan nations had, that you built a temple in order to control a god. That it gave you a holy place in order to invoke the name of that God and to get them to do what you wanted. And I've seen some of the commentators allude to that, but I think it's a stretch, honestly, because the writer does go out of his way to talk about David's motivations here. I don't think we have any real reason to doubt that David means well. He's just learned an important lesson about honoring God. It fits the facts better for me, for David to be trying to do something that is good and maybe to be a little misguided about it. Lida?
I don't, if David used the Torah like he should have known, which has been reviewing it, he would have known that God was going to take a place with
Yeah.
his Moses. And so, to me, I think he could be following the name, but to me, he that God.
And he has some reason to believe that Jerusalem is this place that God has picked. God has agreed with David's actions here. Once the ark was being moved correctly, the ark coming into Jerusalem is something that was approved by God. So it's not the craziest thing in the world for David to think, this is the site of where God will want his house to be built. Let's go ahead and do that. And in fairness, right, it's not totally crazy for another reason, because that is where the temple's going to be built, just not by David. Dave?
Well, now, if you look at the whole thing, first off, God did not command David to build an house on Mount over the house.
Yeah.
That's done on David. So this is from his heart. This
Yeah.
is from what he feels that he should do, because to me, he feels kind of guilty. Now, if you look into what this house is made out of, cedar wood, very expensive,
Yes.
super expensive, very rare. And so now he's going to go, he goes, well, I'm going to purpose to build the Lord a house here for the worship because I want to honor him. That's a great lesson for us.
Yes.
Now, as long as we don't go over the line.
Right.
And start saying, like, this is what happens, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So I think God would like it.
Yes. David's heart is in a good place here, in that he sees how much God has blessed him, and his response is not to grow arrogant and self-centered in this, but to think God deserves my honor and he deserves glory and praise. This is a well-motivated action, if slightly misguided. And yes, the cedar was very expensive. It had to be imported in, typically from Lebanon. That was not something that Israel really grew. And it had to be, floated down the river. I don't know, when I see them talking about bringing the cedar in from Lebanon, to me it sounds like, when somebody says, yeah, I've got real Italian marble brought all the way from Italy. It's expensive. It's you've gone to trouble to get that. There's some prestige attached to it. The cedar was probably even more important to them than Italian marble might be to us. But that's the idea that I get behind it. So, okay, we know that God doesn't really want David to do this. But what reason does God first give for not wanting David to build a house for God? Gary.
He said, have I ever asked anyone to build me a house?
What an interesting question. God says, did I ask for this? Have I ever asked anyone for this? Have I ever been bothered by the idea that I didn't have a house? David is bothered by this, but God has been the God of Israel for generations, and he didn't ever say, oh, I really need a house. He led them out of Egypt just fine. He's been their God all these years. He never commanded any one of the judges to build him one. He never told Saul that Saul should do it. He had not told David that he should do it. I think David's acting sincerely here, but this is not a priority to God. And when God wants a temple to be built, he will command the king to do so, and it's going to be done the way that God wants. So, very interesting to have that reason first. We know some other reasons are going to be developed, and I think it's Chronicles that talks more about David being a man of war, and God saying it's not really fit for you to build this house. I think there's a combination of two things there. Of one, just David's time and attention being drawn away too much from ambitious building projects. That he's going to be in wars a lot. It's hard to be in war and to work on these large civic projects. If you look at the history of nations, they tend to do one or the other at any given time, and hard to do both. Because war is expensive, and war takes your manpower away, and war draws the attention of the leaders away. It's hard to also be working on these things that are going to cost lots of money, lots of manpower. By the time that Solomon builds a temple, it is a monumental effort. It's not like Solomon said, okay, well, we're going to build the temple and it's up in a few weeks. It is a massive effort that takes a lot of his attention and an unbelievable amount of money that is brought together by Solomon, by taxes that are gathered, and by offerings of the people. Lisa? Yes. And I think David knew that, because we have that marker at the beginning of this verse that, God had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies. He sees a lull. He sees that there's opportunity here. I think what he doesn't see is that there is still more war on the horizon. This peace isn't going to last forever, and God has other things that he wants done first. Dave?
One of the things that you notice in First Chronicles 29:2-9, let's say David didn't build the house. He gathered the materials.
Right.
So he purposed in his heart to do that. He purposed ahead of time, over a period of time, like you're talking about.
Yeah.
So think about that for us. When we're building our life and our faith in Christ, we need to purpose what we're going to do to get to that.
Yes.
So it's just, I know it's weird parallel, but for me, it's important parallels, because we're building God's house in our life. And we need to purpose ahead of time, not just do it every day.
Yeah.
Go over today, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
It wasn't an afterthought, is what I'm
Right.
trying to say.
Yeah, David was very thoughtful about all of this, and we'll talk some more about his reaction to what God says. But God has some more things to say first. But yeah, we see that David is looking to do whatever he can do to honor God. And Chronicles shows us that David knows he can't build the temple, but he knows that he can gather some of the materials to make things easier for Solomon. And we see that was a really important thing that he did, because even still, it was a lot for Solomon to pull together. This was a massive undertaking. But the fact that David is going through this thought process of how can I best serve God in my life, in the micro, looking at today, looking at this decision right here, but also in the macro, how can I use the sum of my life, the sum of all of my days, to bring God honor? Like, that really shows to me how much he is a man after God's own heart, that he has found this to be important, and it's a good example for us to think, what life decisions do I need to make in order to serve God in a way that brings him the most glory and the most honor. And sometimes we do look at things only on the small scale of, well, stay away from temptation today. Stay away from the problems that I'm facing, today, or do something good today. But also, what should the course of my life look like? So God doesn't want David to build an ark. I think I've been saying ark. It's not that, a temple. God doesn't want David to build a temple for him, a house for him. And he tells him, hey, I've never commanded you to do this. This is not a priority to me the way that it is a priority for you. What is God's plan instead for David, I guess? Yeah, Steve.
He's going to build him a house instead.
Interesting. He's going to build David a house instead. House is a big key word in this chapter. We've got a lot of interplay between the different meanings of house, because kind of like in English, in Hebrew, you can use house different ways. It can be the structure, or it can be the family. And we do that same kind of thing in English. We talk about the house that I live in, or you can say, the Linden house, the family of Lindens, and the lineage of the Lindens would apply for that as well. So God says, I don't want you to build me a house. I'm going to build you a house. In some ways, this is problematic because David already has a house built. That was the contrast that he had a problem with before, that he lived in a house of cedar. And your translation might say palace, but it's still house all throughout. It's using that word play all the way through. That he lives in the house of cedar, yet God does not have a house. God's house is just this tent. And this bothers him. And so in an effort to try to balance the scales better, or even better, put God in the highest place, he wants to build God a house. And God says, nope, I'm going to still build you a house. I'm going to bless you more. But there's a reason for this. And this time we're not really talking about the physical dwelling that David lives in, but instead what his family is going to be, his lineage, that God has a purpose for the line of David. So what's the idea here? What needs to be built up in the house of David, and why might God care? Gary.
I think that's an important phrase in verse 12 that says, would you rest with your fathers? That's a ways off.
Yeah.
That's connected with, I'm going to build you a house after you're dead.
Yeah.
So what house is that?
Right. God is thinking on a larger time scale than David is. And I don't say that to dig at David. This is more about God's ability to look at things on the broader time scale, because God is not confined to the span of a human life. One of the things that's very common that we see in the change in how people look at things is the older we get, the closer to death we get, the more we start thinking about legacy. Like, how do I want to be remembered? How can I best help my children, my grandchildren, in the lives that they are going to lead? Because that day is coming closer where I'm not going to be here. So what mark can I leave on the world? And so, just generally speaking, we see an uptick in people thinking about how they're donating to charities or in making arrangements for family or generally considering what happens after I am gone. That's a natural part of the aging process. But even still, there's only so much that we can really encapsulate, only so much that we can deal with in the scale that makes sense to us. So if I say, how are we going to solve the problems in the year 2200? I don't even know what the problems are in the year 2200. And my children aren't going to know either. In that this is so far in the future that it's just outside of our ability to really deal with. There might be some limited ways that we can try to impact things that far off, but we don't even really know what they're going to need then or how things are going to change, much less have an ability to really manipulate events that far in the future. Yet, is that far in the future? That's 180 years from now. That's not really in the scale of time. That's not that far away. Yet we struggle because that's so far beyond our lifespans. Ida?
You're talking about the future, and God wanted to build him a house, and there would always be a king
Yes.
on the throne. And I find it interesting that throughout, when it talks about his descendants, it always talks, compares to David,
Yes.
whether good or bad, mostly bad.
Yeah.
But it always compares them to him. And so we are big different. Well, at least we see it in the Bible, and they have the writing, they look at history. But God continued that household throughout the time, even more than 150 years.
Right. Yeah. And that's kind of the idea here, that God's plans for Israel and God's plans for the world go so far into the future from this point that God has to be thinking about more than just David. Just like when he made the promises to Abraham, he was thinking about more than just Abraham. Yet, how far back was Abraham compared to David? We lump all these people together as historical figures, but to David, Abraham was a historical figure. He's so far back that he's just, an artifact of history. Yet God was making promises back then, and God was speaking almost casually about things like, oh, your descendants are going to be in slavery in Egypt for 400 years. And again, like 400 years, I can't manipulate events that last for 400 years. I'm not going to live anywhere near that long. That just seems like an incredible amount of time. But that's not a limitation to God. God can still keep his promises even through those hundreds of years, through thousands of years. And so God is concerned with not just what's happening in the lifespan of David or even into the next generation that David might be thinking of, but in all the generations that will come after that. That's what God is talking about when he says, I will build you a house. David's lineage and what that will mean for Israel and what that will mean for God's ultimate promise for mankind, through the line of David. Steve.
The house symbolizes protection and shelter and peace and comfort.
Yeah.
In retrospect, I think when David wants to build God a house, it's almost like an insult because God doesn't need that stuff.
Yeah.
He's all powerful. He doesn't need protection and peace. He already has all that.
Yeah. So this is why it's not a priority for God. It's not that there being a temple is a bad thing. Like Solomon's going to build God a temple. So it's not evil. It's not a totally crazy idea. But it's not because God needs it. It's not because that even Israel has to have a temple in order to interact with God or in order to invoke the name of God or to be blessed by God. God has been their God for this long, and he has done great and mighty things for them with no house at all. That's going to continue. And God will be able to work in David's life and in the lives of that generation while there is no temple. God still wants for a temple to be built, more for Israel's benefit than for his, but it's not on the top of the priority list. Because what's more important is that the line of David be established. Okay?
Well, he wouldn't fit in a house.
Yeah.
God was too fast.
Right.
And when their temple was built, it was his footstool
Yeah.
for his feet. But, I wanted to ask you a question. Do you think David understood what God was talking about? Do you think he understood the messianic message to Israel?
So let me first say something about your first point. I like the way you said that about the temple not being big enough to contain God. Like, it's funny, but think about the way the pagans viewed their temples. They did think that the temples could contain their gods. Sometimes, when we talk about like the ziggurats and such, they had a little room at the top for the god to rest in as he came down. And so the idea was that God would come down, to the ziggurat. It's basically a ladder to the supernatural, and that the God is able to take a rest in the little room there set aside for him, and then he's able to come all the way down and to work great deeds for them. That's what a man needs. A man needs a place to rest. A man needs a room to dwell in. Gods need that according to the pagans, but the one true God does not need that. This is not the place that God lives. This is not the place that he takes a rest or the place that he has his meals or anything like that. That was not the purpose of a temple being built. And so this is yet another reason why it is not high on the priority list. Now, as far as your other question, did David understand these messianic connections? Hard to know. I think David at least had a partial understanding. I'm not sure anybody had a full understanding of what the Messiah was going to do. But David, as a man who knew God well, as a man who knew the scriptures well, would have known that there was a promise given to Abraham that through his seed the whole world would be blessed. So there's something to that promise beyond just the nation of Israel. That this is about more than the Israelites. Exactly what that is probably eluded them. And David probably did not have the fullness of understanding that we do today. Yet it was still very important to them. Okay, we have a few hands up. Lito?
Yeah, I think this is the plan of God as a covenant with David, and as we have said, it's not time only, not generation, but it's going to go forever. And we know that David became an example of all these characters.
Yeah.
We should have as a forerunner of the coming Messiah to introduce to us all the prophecy, but sooner or later now, but in our time, we already find Jesus our example.
Yeah, David in Scripture serves as a shadow of Jesus, that he is kind of a proto-Messiah in a similar way that Moses is a proto-Messiah. And I don't say that to be blasphemous, but you think of the connections here that David serves as a righteous king over God's people. Moses served as a righteous deliverer and lawgiver. But they fall short in that they're not able to fully solve the problems that Israel has. And they don't live in perfection. They don't have complete purity of heart. They still have problems and sins that they're dealing with. And so all of these proto-messiahs or shadows of Messiah are going to be overshadowed when the real thing comes. Okay, Dave?
Well, that also part of his plan, long-term plan,
Yes.
God's, he said no to David's offer of an important reason in 1 Chronicles 22. Because David was a man of war,
Yes.
not a man of peace. So he didn't want a man of war to build his temple. When you read that, it says, "But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, You have shed much blood and made great wars. You shall not build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight. A son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of rest. He shall build, a house for my name."
Yeah.
Talking about Jesus, obviously.
Yeah.
So he's trying to push the idea of peace,
Yeah.
through Christ, and not building. And besides that, it's not like you can run down to Home Depot and buy cedar.
Yeah.
I mean, that's going to eventually just
Yeah.
go away. So
Right.
it's just important to remember what
It
God
is.
told David that David knew.
And all these messianic connections we're making, that, of course, like you're identifying that it's talking about Jesus. It's first talking about Solomon, right? But is it like really talking about Solomon on every level? Like, no, there's another level to this. And this is a common thing in the Old Testament, that you have a first fulfillment in something more immediate, and then a second fulfillment later. In fact, sometimes you can do multiple layers, where you have a fulfillment in the short term, a fulfillment in, a lot of times there's a connection to the exile and to the return from captivity, and then an ultimate fulfillment when Jesus comes. And maybe you want to put a layer beyond that of fulfillment when Jesus returns and brings peace forever, and that brings an end to all problems of sin. So you can see this layered effect in Scripture, where you have different levels of interpretation or different levels of understanding of fulfillment. And that's why we can't just read 2 Samuel 7 and say, well, this is the story of why David couldn't build a temple. There's more to it than that. Okay. Mark.
Yeah, there's so much here.
Yes.
There's a lot about, as you said, about the forever language that's in here that talks about them not being conquered again
Yeah.
forever.
Yes.
Well, that's not true.
Yeah.
So there has to be reconciliation because God's not a liar. So
Yeah.
we understand this. And so David understands it too as well. I think in verse 19, he talks about this being the manner of, one version says, is this the manner of man? In other words, this is a spiritual thing. God's talking about the future. This is some kind of prophecy. He doesn't understand it.
Yeah.
But he knows that this is the goodness of God coming before his house.
Right.
Whatever form that might be. I don't think he understood it, getting back to what Kay asked. I don't think he understood exactly what it meant.
Yeah.
It was too great for him to understand. They didn't understand it when Jesus came, they didn't understand it.
Yeah.
It was a hidden thing.
Right.
And that's the beauty of what God does. And for me, when I'm reading this, I think, again, I mentioned last week, I look at the personal pronouns. David comes with a me idea. Here's my idea. And God says, I am doing this.
Yeah.
And this is a big message. This is what David's talking about for all Christians.
Right.
We might have a big idea. Whether or not it's in God's plan, we need to make sure that aligns.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. Ida?
This, along with other passages in scripture, this completes our faith in God so much. Because, and we shouldn't sell God short and just follow our ideas. Oh, well, that's not good. Oh, well, we have to be realistic. There's plenty of things. No, we need to follow God. God's going to make it happen. Tell everything needs to happen. And it's beyond our imagination
We're going to talk in tonight's sermon, one of the points being how God works through small people and small things to do great things. God works with, little old me and with the little congregation of Philadelphia and things that seem too small to be a useful tool in God's hand, yet God is able to do great things, even with small things. So that's a good point in here, that we need to not limit God. We need to not say these things aren't possible, but to understand that God has a purpose and a goal in mind, and that he is accomplishing great things. So to Mark's point about the forever statements, I wanted to identify these. There are 3 forever statements in this section. Verse 13 says, "He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." And verse 16 has 2 of them, "And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me." And verse 16 as well, "Your throne shall be established forever." And there's an interesting problem there, as Mark alluded to, that on one level, this doesn't seem to be true. We say the line is unbroken of descendants of David ruling over Israel until it's broken. Like there's this big shocking moment, and I always bring this up because it's in the book of Jeremiah where the people keep saying, well, nothing bad's going to happen to us. We're God's chosen people. We have the temple. We have the Ark of the Covenant. We are Abraham's children. Everything's going to be just fine. And they said that with the Babylonian army on the horizon and moving in to conquer them, as everything is just fine. And it wasn't. That God did allow them to be taken into captivity. And there was a break in Israel and in Judah having leaders over them from David's lineage. The point here is that God was always thinking beyond something bigger than just who is ruling there in Jerusalem. That the forever statement is connecting this to a bigger idea, connecting this to the kingdom of God that would come down upon the earth, that would bless all of mankind, would ultimately be fulfilled in Jesus, to the point that now, spiritually speaking, it's irrelevant who is ruling in Jerusalem. That's an astounding thing to say from the perspective of 2 Samuel 7. Irrelevant who's ruling in Jerusalem. Of course it's relevant. But not really anymore, because it's relevant who is ruling over the church, who is ruling over the world. Okay?
I know you don't have time to do this today, but forever means different things. And I was wondering if you could address that maybe next time. The word forever sometimes was meant till the end of this age, and sometimes it meant for eternity. So
That can mean different things, yet I still think we have a pretty open-ended promise being made here of David's line continuing on. And the thing is, now it continues on in Jesus, and there's no one to pass it on to after that. That Jesus reigns forever. And so that's the main idea here. Leader?
Yeah, I think one of the forever that we talk about here is Luke 1:33, I read this in chapter 1, verse from Luke, when the angel visited Mary and was telling him about all the prophecy, and it reads like this, 1:33. And the Lord God, the Son of the Church, he will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. And of his kingdom there will be no end.
Yeah. This was always the great fulfillment of God's promise to David.
Just to address what Kay is talking about, that forever statement means it's a vanishing point. As far as you can see.
Yeah. Right.
Well, who's making the forever statement? If it's man, that's as far as you can see. Is it God making a forever statement? Who would put a limit on God? That's
Right.
my-
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at that. You know, with God saying it, that's as far out as God can see. The only way that can really be true is for that to be fulfilled in Jesus to be able to reign forever. All right. Really, well, we'll talk about it next week. Next week, we'll look at how David responded to God vetoing his plan, and then definitely move on to chapter 8 as well. Thanks.